reading The Neverending Story, Chapter 1. This inscription could be seen on the glass doors of a small shop, but naturally this was only the way it looked if you were inside the dimly lit shop, looking out at the street through the plate glass door. Outside it was a gray, cold, rainy November morning. The rain ran down the glass and over the ornate letters. Through the glass doors, there was nothing to be seen but the rain-splotched wall across the street. Suddenly, the door was opened so violently that a little cluster of brass bells tinkled wildly, taking quite some time to calm down. The cause of this hubbub was a fat little boy of 10 or 12. His wet, dark brown hair hung down over his face. His coat was soaked and dripping, and he was carrying a school satchel slung over his shoulder. He was rather pale, out of breath, but despite the hurry he had in a moment before, he was standing in the open doorway as though rooted by the spot. Before him lay a long, narrow room, the back of which was lost in half-light. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books of all shapes and sizes. Large folios were piled high on the floor, and on several tables lay heaps of smaller leather-bound books whose spines glittered with gold. The far end of the room was blocked off by a shoulder-high wall of books, behind which the light of a lamp could be seen. From time to time, a ring of smoke rose up in the lamp light, expanded, vanishing into the darkness. One was reminded of the smoke signals that Indians used for sending news from hilltop to hilltop. Apparently someone was sitting there, and sure enough, the little boy heard a cross voice from behind the wall of books. "Do your wandering inside or outside, but shut the door, there's a draft." The boy obeyed and quietly shut the door. Then he approached the wall of books and looked cautiously around the corner. There, in a high-worn leather-winged chair, sat a short, stout man in rumpled black suit that looked frayed and somehow dusty. His paunch was held in by a vest of flowery design. He was bald except for outcroppings of white hair around his ears. His red face suggested a vicious bulldog. A gold-rimmed Prince Nez was perched on his bulbous nose. He was smoking a curved pipe, which dangled from the corner of his mouth and pulled his whole cheek out of shape. On his lap, he held a book, which he had evidently been reading, for in closing it he had left the thick forefinger of his left hand between the leaves as a kind of a bookmark. With his right hand, he removed his spectacles, examined the fat little boy, who stood there dripping. After a while, the man narrowed his eyes, which made him look like he was more vicious than ever, and muttered, "Goodness gracious." Then he opened his book and went on reading. The little boy didn't know quite what to do, so he just stood there, gaping. Finally, the man closed his book, as before with his finger between the pages, and growled, "Listen, my boy, I can't abide children. I know it's the style nowadays to make a terrible fuss over you, but I don't go for it. I simply have no use for children. As far as I'm concerned, they're no good for anything but screaming, torturing people, breaking things, smearing books with jam and tearing pages. It never dawns on them that grown-ups may also have their troubles and cares. I'm only telling you this so you'll know where you're at. Anyway, I have no children's books. I wouldn't sell you the other kind, so now we understand each other, I hope." After saying all this without taking his pipe out of his mouth, he opened his book and went on reading. The boy nodded slightly and turned to go, but somehow he felt that he couldn't take that last remark lying down. He turned around and he said softly, "All children aren't like that." Slowly, the man looked up again, removed his spectacles. "You still here? What must one do to get rid of you? And what was this terribly important thing you had to tell me?" "It wasn't terribly important," said the boy, still softly. "I only wanted to say that all children aren't what you said." "Really?" The man raised his eyebrow in affected surprise. "You must be the big exception, I presume?" The fat boy didn't know what to say. He only shrugged his shoulders a little, turned to go. "Anyway," he heard the gruff voice behind him, "where are your manners? If you had any, you'd introduce yourself." "My name is Bastian. Bastian Balthazar Bucks," he said. "It's a rather odd name," the man grumbled. "All those bees. Oh, well, you can't help it. You didn't choose it. My name is Conrad Coreander." "That makes 3 C's. The man grumbled. "Quite right." He puffed a few clouds. "Oh, well, our names don't really matter, as we'll see. We'll never see each other again. But before you leave, there's just one thing I want to know. What made you come in here, bursting into my shop like that? Looked to me as if you were running away from something. Am I right?" Bastian nodded. Suddenly his round face was a little paler than before, and his eyes a little larger. "Suppose you made off with somebody's cash box?" Mr. Coreander conjectured. "Or knocked an old woman down? Whatever little scamps like you are doing nowadays. Are the police after you?" Bastian shook his head. "Speak up. Whom are you running away from?" "The others." "What others?" "Children in my class." "Why?" "They won't leave me alone." "What they do to you?" "They wait for me outside the schoolhouse." Then they all shout some sorts of stuff. And they push me around and they laugh at me. "You just put up with it?" Mr. Coreander looked at the boy a little disapprovingly. Then he asked, "Why don't you just give him a punch in the nose?" Bastian gaped. "No, I wouldn't want to do that. Besides, I can't box." "How about wrestling?" Mr. Coreander asked. "Or running, swimming, football, gymnastics. Are you no good at any of them?" The boy shook his head. "In other words, you're a weakling," he said. Bastian shrugged his shoulders. "But you can still talk," Mr. Coreander said. "Why don't you talk back at them when they make fun of you?" "I tried." "Well?" "They threw me into a garbage can and tied the lid. I yelled for 2 hours before somebody even heard me." Mr. Coreander grumbled. "Now you don't dare, right?" Bastian nodded. "In that case, you're a scaredy cat, too," Mr. Coreander concluded. Bastian hung his head. "Probably hopeless grind, too. Best in the class, teacher's pet, that it?" "No," said Bastian, still looking down. "I was put back last year." "Good Lord, cried Mr. Coreander. "A failure all along the line." Bastian said nothing. He just stood there in his dripping wet coat. His arms hung limp at his side. "What kind of things do you yell when they make fun of you?" Mr. Coreander wanted to know. "Oh, all kinds." "For instance?" "Namby-pamby sits on the pot. The pot cracks up, says namby-pamby. I guess it's because I weigh a lot." Not very clever, said Mr. Coreander. What else? Bastian hesitated before listening. Screwball, nitwit, braggart, liar. Screwball, Mr. Coreander interjected. Why do they call you that? I talk to myself sometimes. What kind of things do you say? Well, I think up stories. I invent names and words that don't exist, that kind of thing. You say those things to yourself? Why? Well, nobody else is interested. Mr. Coreander fell into a thoughtful silence. What do your parents say about that? Bastian didn't answer right away. After a while, he mumbled, Father doesn't say anything. He never says anything. It's all the same to him. And your mother? She's gone. Parents are divorced? No, Bastian said. She's dead. At that moment, the telephone rang. With some difficulty, Mr. Coreander pulled himself out of the armchair, shuffled into a small room behind the shop. He picked up the receiver. Indistinctly, Bastian heard him saying his name. After that, there was nothing to be heard but a low mumble. Bastian stood there. He didn't know quite why he'd said all that, and why he admitted so much. He hated being questioned like that. He broke into a sweat as it occurred to him that he was already late for school. He'd have to hurry. Oh yes, hurry. He'd have to run. But he just stood there, unable to move. Something held him fast. He didn't know what. He could still hear the muffled voice from behind the back room. It was a long telephone conversation. It came to Bastian that he had been staring at the whole time at the book that Mr. Coreander had been holding, and that was now lying on the armchair. He couldn't take his eyes off of it. It seemed to have a kind of a magnetic power that attracted him irresistibly. He went over to the chair, slowly held up his hand and touched the book. In that moment, something clicked inside him, as though a trap had shut. Bastian had a vague feeling that touching this book had started something irrevocably, which would now take its course. He picked up the book, examined it from all sides. It was bound in copper-colored silk that seemed to shimmer when he moved it about. Leafing through the pages, he saw that the book was printed in 2 colors. There seemed to be no pictures, but there were large, beautiful capital letters at the beginning of each chapter. Examining the binding more closely, he discovered 2 snakes on it, one light and one dark. They were biting each other's tails and forming an oval. And inside the oval, in strange, intricate letters, he saw the title, Neverending Story. Human passions have mysterious ways, in children as well as grown-ups. Those affected by them can't explain them, and those who haven't known have no understanding of them at all. Some people risk their lives to conquer mountain peak. No one, not even they themselves, can really explain why. Others ruin themselves trying to win the heart of a certain person who wants nothing to do with them. Still others are destroyed by their devotion to pleasures of the table. Some are bent on winning a game of chance that they lose everything they own, and some sacrifice everything for a dream that can never come true. Some think their only hope of happiness lies in being somewhere else, and spend their whole life traveling from place to place. And some find no rest until they have become powerful. In short, there are many different passions as there are people. Bastian Balthasar Bucks's passion was books. If you've never spent a whole afternoon while burning ears and with burning ears and rumpled hair, forgetting the world around you over a book, forgetting the cold and hunger. If you have never read secretly under a bedcloth with a flashlight because your father or mother or some other well-meaning person has switched off the lamp on the plausible ground that it was time to sleep because you had to be up early. If you have never wept bitter tears because of a wonderful story has come to an end and you must take your leave of the character with whom you have shared so many adventures, whom you have loved and admired, for whom you have hoped and feared, and without whose company life seems empty and meaningless. If such things have not been part of your own experience, you probably won't understand what Bastian did next. Staring at the title of this book, he turned hot and cold and hot. Here was just what he had dreamed of, what he had longed for ever since the passion for books had taken hold of him, a story that never ended, the book of books. He had to have this book at any price. At any price. That was easily said. Even if he had more to offer than the bit of pocket money he had on him, this cranky Mr. Coreander had given him clearly to understand that he would never sell a single book. Not to him. And he certainly wouldn't give it away. The situation was hopeless. Yet Bastian knew he couldn't leave without this book. It was clear to him that he had only come to this shop because of this book. It called to him in some mysterious way because he wanted it to be his. It wanted it to be his. Because it somehow always belonged to him. Bastian listened to the mumbling from the little back room. In a twinkling, before he knew it, he had the book under his coat and was hugging it with both arms. Without a sound, he backed up to the street door, keeping an anxious eye on the other door, the one leading to the back room. Cautiously, he turned the door handle. To keep the brass bells from ringing, he opened the glass door just wide enough for him to slip through, and he quietly closed it behind him. Only then did he start running. The books, copybooks, pens, and pencils, and that were all in his satchel, jingled as he rattled through the rhythm of his steps. He had stitches in his side, but he kept on running. The rain ran down his face and into his collar. The cold wet passed through his coat, but Bastian didn't feel it. He felt hot all over, but not from running. His conscience, which hadn't let out a peep in the bookshop, had suddenly woken up. All the arguments that seemed to be convincing melted away like snowmen under the fiery breath of a dragon. He had stolen. He was a thief. What he had done was worse than common theft. That book was certainly the only of its kind and impossible to replace. It was surely Mr. Coreander's greatest treasure. Stealing a violinist's precious violin or a king's crown wasn't at all the same as filching money from a cash drawer. As he ran, he hugged the book tighter under his coat. Regardless of what this book might have cost him, he couldn't bear to lose it. It's all he had left in the entire world. Because naturally, he couldn't go home anymore. He tried to imagine his father at work in the big room he had furnished as a laboratory. Around him lay dozens of plaster casts of human teeth, for his father was a dental technician. Bastian had never stopped to ask himself if his father enjoyed his work. It occurred to him now for the first time, but now he would never be able to ask him. If he went home now, his father would come out of his lab in a white smock, possibly holding a plaster cast, and he would ask, "Home so soon?" "Yes," Bastian would answer. "No school today?" He saw his father's quiet, sad face, and he knew he couldn't possibly lie to him. Much less could he tell him the truth. No, the only thing left for him was to go away somewhere, far, far away. His father must never find out that his son was a thief. Maybe he wouldn't notice that Bastian wasn't there anymore. Bastian found this thought almost comforting. He'd stopped running. Walking slowly, he saw the schoolhouse at the end of the street. Without thinking, he was taking his usual route to school. He passed a few people here and there, yet the street seemed deserted. But to a schoolboy arriving very, very late, the world around the schoolhouse always seemed to have gone dead. At every step, he felt the fear rising within him. Under the best of circumstances, he was afraid of school, the place of his daily defeats, afraid of his teachers, who gently appealed to his conscience or made him the butt of their rages, afraid of the other children, who made fun of him and never missed a chance to show him how clumsy and defenseless he was. He had always thought of his school years as a prison term with no end in sight, a misery that would continue until he grew up, something he would just have to live through. But when he now passed through the echoing corridors with their smell of floor wax and wet overcoats, when the lurking stillness suddenly stopped his ears like cotton, and when he last reached the door of his classroom, which was painted the same old spinach-colored as the walls around it, he realized that this, too, was no place for him. He'd have to go away. So he might as well go all at once. But where to? Bastian had read stories about boys who ran away to sea and sailed out into the world to make their fortune. Some became pirates or heroes. Others grew rich, and when they returned home years later, no one could guess who they were. But Bastian didn't feel up to that kind of thing. He couldn't conceive of anyone taking him on as a cabin boy. Besides, he had no idea how to reach a seaport, not one with suitable ships for any such of an undertaking. Where could he go? Suddenly he thought of the right place, the only place where, at least for the time being, no one would find him or even look. The attic of the school. It was large and dark. It smelled of dust and mothballs, not a single sound to be heard except for the muffled drumming of the rain on the enormous tin roof. Great beams, blackened with age, rose at regular intervals from the plank floors. They were joined with other beams at head height and lost themselves in the darkness. Here and there, spider webs as big as hammocks swayed gently in the air currents. A milky light fell from a skylight in the roof. The one living thing in this place where it seemed to stand still was a little mouse that came hobbling across the floor, leaving tiny footprints in the dust. And between them, a fine line because of his tail. Suddenly it stopped, pricked its ears up, and then it vanished. Whoosh. It vanished into a hole in the floor. The mouse had heard the sound of a key in a big lock. The attic door opened slowly with a loud squeak. For a moment, a long strip of light crossed the room. Bastian slipped in. Then again with a squeak, the door closed. Bastian put the big key in the lock from inside and turned it. Then he pushed the bolt, heaved a sigh of relief. Now no one could possibly find him. No one would look for him here. The place was seldom used. He was pretty sure of that. And even if, by some chance, someone had something to do in the attic today or tomorrow, they would simply find the door locked and the key was gone. And even if they somehow got the door open, Bastian would have time to hide because that's where all the junk was stored. Little by little, his eyes got glued to the dim light. He knew the place. Some months before, he had helped the janitor to carry a laundry basket full of copybooks up here. And then he had seen where the key to the attic door was kept, in a wall cupboard next to the topmost flight of stairs. He hadn't thought of it since, but today, somehow he remembered. Bastian began to shiver. His coat was soaked through and through, and it was cold in the attic already. The first thing to do was find a place where he could make himself more or less comfortable, because he took it for granted that he'd have a chance to stay here a long time. How long? The question didn't seem to enter his head, nor did it occur to him that he would soon be hungry or thirsty. He looked around for a while. The place was cramped with junk of all kinds. There were shelves full of old files and records. Benches, ink-stained desks were heaped up on every which way. A dozen old maps were hanging on an old iron frame. There were blackboards that had lost a good deal of their black, and cast iron stoves, broken down pieces of gymnasium equipment, including a horse with the stuffing coming out through the cracks of its hide, and a number of soiled mats. There were also quite a few stuffed animals, at least what the moths had left of them. A big owl, a golden eagle, a fox, and so on. Cracked retorts and other chemical equipment, galvanometer, a human skeleton hanging on a clothes rack, and a large number of cartons full of old books and papers. Bastian finally decided to make his home on the pile of old gym mats. When he stretched out on them, it was almost like lying on a sofa. He dragged them to the place where the skylight, under the skylight where the light was best. Not far away, he found a pile of gray army blankets. They were dusty and ragged, but that didn't matter now. He carried them over to his nest. He took off his wet coat, hung it on the clothes rack beside the skeleton. The skeleton jiggled and swayed, but Bastian had no fear of it. Maybe because he was used to such things at home. He also removed his wet shoes. In his stocking feet, he squatted down on the mats and wrapped himself in the gray blanket like an Indian. Beside him lay his school satchel and the copper-colored book. It passed through his mind that the rest of them were down in classrooms. They would be having history right about now. Maybe they'd be writing a composition on some deadly dull subject. But Bastian looked at the book. I wonder, he said to himself, what's in a book while it's closed? I know it's full of letters printed on paper, but all the same, something must be happening. Because as soon as I open it, there's a whole story with people I don't know yet, and all kinds of adventures and deeds and battles. And sometimes there are storms at sea, or it takes you to strange cities, strange countries. All those things are somehow shut up in a book. Of course, you had to read it to find out. But it's already there. That's the funny thing. I just wish I knew how it could be. Suddenly, an almost festive mood came over him. He settled himself, picked up the book, opened the big page, and began to read the never-ending story. Okay, that was chapter 1, and oh my gosh. I so relate to this kid. I don't know if anybody knows, but when I was a kid, I was absolutely picked on. I was made fun of. I never fit in. I never felt in place. And everywhere I went, I felt like I had to, it was me versus the world. Everyone, everywhere, everything. So to be this kid, to live through the eyes, to live through the eyes of Bastian, you know, every angle he was at, he was made fun of. He was picked on by teachers, by students. His father didn't even notice whether he was there or not. His mother had been gone for years. He just had this one escape: books. Because in a book, you know, like when it's closed, it's just words on a page, right? But as soon as you open it up, you have characters. You have people that you're going to get to meet and fall in love with, or you're going to hate drastically. You know, there's going to be villains that you so badly want to beat. And you're going to meet people and characters that You want so badly for them to succeed. Even if they fail, you just want them to keep trying and keep going and fight and survive. I love this book. That was chapter 1. And it only gets better there because that actually ended right where the real book starts. And the real characters and the real monsters. And it's amazing. Okay.